As we've just passed the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I thought it'd be interesting to see how this, and it is the first major armoured conflict in Europe since 1945, has developed, and how the kit and the tactics used have evolved. In common with a lot of other people, when the Russian special military operation started, I didn't think what was thought of as the second best army in the world would have much difficulty rolling over the defence forces of a much smaller country. How come then that the second best army in the world seems to have started to resemble the second best army in Ukraine? We need to look at three things: the strategy and tactics used by both sides, and particularly how those used by the Russian army have evolved from World War II through the Cold War up to the present day. We need to look at the equipment, and as with the Tank Museum, specifically the armour that has been deployed and how its use has changed. And finally, the command structure of the Russian army. Starting with the tactical side, it's pretty obvious that the tactics employed by the Russian army have changed several times during the course of the campaign. The first phase could almost be described as blitzkrieg, and it's an assault by combined airborne, amphibious and ground forces on a number of fronts, right from Kyiv and Kharkiv in the north round to the Black Sea coast. It's preceded by a heavy missile barrage, and this is designed to disrupt Ukrainian air defence and command and control. It almost succeeds, and in fact swathes of land are lost down towards Black Sea and over in the Donbass, but it fails spectacularly in the north, and that is where the Ukrainian defence is tougher and better prepared. Kharkiv, the second city, held on by a whisker, and near Kyiv, an attempt by airborne troops to take Hostomel airbase failed with huge casualties. The armoured columns trying to break through were fought to a standstill. The Russian victory parade in Kyiv would have to be postponed. In April and May, the Russian forces are resorting to almost sort of classic Soviet warfare techniques. Massed artillery barrage, followed by assault by what we call BTGs, battalion tactical groups. We will talk about them a little bit later on, but essentially they are a motor rifle battalion with artillery, armour and logistical support. The tactics they're using here are very similar to those used by the Soviet army in World War II. But the thing is, these days, the battlefield is a rather different place. ISTAR, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance, is a real game changer on the modern battlefield. Large targets like armoured columns can be tracked by drone or satellite surveillance, targeted and destroyed. The last operation of this phase was a large-scale attempt to cross the Siversky Donets River by pontoon bridge. This was disastrous, and it led to the loss of up to 100 AFVs and perhaps 500 men. In the third phase, which runs from June, Russian offensive action is scaled down, and they're mostly relatively light probing attacks trying to find weaknesses in the Ukrainian lines. These do achieve a bit of success in Luhansk and Donetsk, but they're also failures at places like Pavlivka. And they're also very wasteful of elite forces like naval infantry and paratroops. These are the guys who are sustaining heavy casualties. With the onset of winter, we move into what you could call the fourth phase. And this has the Russian army resorting to what almost look like the tactics of World War I. Assaults by infantry against prepared Ukrainian positions with heavy losses. This phase has led to huge losses for really quite minimal gains. I mean, a recent report was suggesting 824 Russian dead and wounded per day. But the whole thing about it is these are mostly either PMC Wagner convicts or conscripts. And we've got to really presume that the Russian High Command regards these guys as expendable. So it's worth taking the losses to keep Ukrainian forces pinned down in position and maintain a war of attrition. So, where do we go from here? As the spring campaigning season opens, President Putin has shown every sign of wanting to continue the war, and equally the Ukrainians have every intention of driving the invader off their soil. So at this juncture, I think it's worth looking at our perception of the Russian army and the kit and the tactics that they have been using. To start with, let's look at two Soviet-era vehicles, the T-72 tank and the BMP infantry fighting vehicle, that are still plentiful on both sides in Ukraine. This is a T-72, and this is a classic Soviet-designed Cold War main battle tank. It's designed for a conscript army, so it's rugged, reliable, and relatively simple. It has a low profile and a very powerful 125mm gun. Now, this is a T-72M, and that's what you might call the export version. So this would be supplied to client states, members of the Warsaw Pact, that sort of thing. It lacks a bit of the finesse of the vehicles that was actually supplied to the Russian army. What you will see in Ukraine are mostly T-72B3s. Now these have a few improvements. They've got explosive reactive armour on the front and on the turret, and they've got an improved fire control system. But the question is, why are the Russians losing so many of these tanks? Why are so many being destroyed? To see why that happens, we need to look inside.
As I mentioned before, this tank has a very low profile. Now in combat, that's obviously a good thing, because it makes it, as a target, harder to acquire, harder to hit. But to do that, to achieve that, they had to get rid of a crew member, the loader. Now to compensate for that, they fitted auto loader. And what that is a carousel affair underneath the turret floor down there, and then a lift that actually picks the round up, puts it in the breech, and then ejects the spent case through the hatch up here. So far so good. But it also makes the turret space, as you can see here, very cramped indeed, and of course the ammunition stowage is underneath the turret itself. Now the T-72 as a tank was designed for conventional tank-on-tank warfare, so we're expecting incoming rounds to impact on the front of the vehicle. And that's where you have the thickest armour, that's where the ERA, explosive reactive armour, is fitted.
The problem is that modern anti-tank weapons, things like NLAW and Javelin, have a top attack capability. What that means is they'll locate the target and then hit either the back or the top of the turret, and that's where the armour is thinnest. What that does in a lot of cases is to set off the rounds stored underneath the turret. That's why you see so many T-72s with the turret blown off and completely destroyed. We've recently seen some T-72s in Ukraine fitted with what's colloquially been called cope cages. That's extra armour on top of the turret, on top of the back of the tank. Now this is designed to protect against aerial bombs dropped by drones, or to some extent it may provide some protection from top attack anti-tank weapons. The next vehicle I would like to talk about is this one. This is the BMP-1, and you'll be familiar with that from television footage, I'm sure. Now, the BMP-1 is 1960s design, and when it comes out, it's quite revolutionary. BMP means Bojowa Maszyna Piechoty, infantry fighting vehicle. And that is quite a revolutionary concept. NATO forces have got APCs, armoured personnel carriers, things like the American M113, the British FV432, but they do exactly what it says on the tin. They are armoured personnel carriers, they're battle taxis. Now the idea of having a vehicle that can not only carry a squad of 8 infantrymen across a battlefield at the same speed as a tank, but also has the ability to mix it with other AFVs, that's actually quite a revolutionary one. Now the BMP, it's a bit of an antique these days in all honesty. There are a lot more BMP2s, BMP3s in Ukraine, but there are still a substantial number of BMP1s around. BMP1 has a fairly simple 2-piece welded hull and a stubby turret mounting a 73mm Grom smoothbore low velocity gun and a Saga anti-tank missile, a wire-guided missile. The idea here is that the Grom will engage targets out to about 700 metres. The Saga will do the same job from about 500 up to 3,000 metres. That provided very good anti-tank capability, but it's not so good against other targets, and particularly they're finding this in places like Afghanistan. So in later marks in the BMP2, BMP3, the Grom is replaced with a 30mm auto cannon. Now this vehicle has had what I'd call an eventful life. It was used by Warsaw Pact armies. It may in fact have seen service in Afghanistan, looking at some of the battle damage, which had been overpainted in Warsaw Pact green paint. But it was then passed on to the Iraqi army, and it was captured by the British Army in the First Iraq War. Inside, it's really in quite a parlous state. I mean, you stick your head in there and it actually smells like a captured vehicle. Here in the back of the vehicle, you've got space for 8 infantrymen, and then up at the front, the 3 crew members, the commander, the driver, and the turret gunner. It's pretty cramped in here. The infantry each have a periscope, and rather strangely, they each have a firing point. Now, I don't know, but if I put the muzzle of the weapon in there, I can't imagine these were much use, because the arcs are really distinctly limited. It would just be targets of opportunity. One of the problems encountered in Afghanistan is that a mine strike under the left-hand track would kill or incapacitate both the driver and the commander, because they're sat both quite close together. And of course, if that happens, it's game over for the vehicle. The thing that a lot of people do remark on, the fact that these big back doors are actually fuel tanks, that's not such a problem, because they are auxiliary fuel tanks and they're just there to increase road range. Ideally, by the time you get into combat, these are empty. But probably a bigger problem than that is the fact that the main fuel tank is here, between the 2 rows of seats in the back. Now, if the vehicle's hit and that is set on fire, the results for anybody sitting inside are going to be quite horrific. Because of its overall shape and its construction, the BMP range is actually quite difficult to up armour, although some later models, mainly BMP 2s and 3s, have been retrofitted with ERA, and that's explosive reactive armour. Moving away from kit to tactics, the Russian army, and before that the Soviet army, the command system was always regarded as very inflexible and monolithic, and there's no concept of mission command below divisional or possibly regimental level. In fact, I remember being told by one of our instructors that nobody in the then Soviet army below the rank of major was allowed a map, because it wasn't thought necessary that soldiers needed to know where they were in order to fight, as long as they followed orders. And of course this also applied to different arms, different formations, so artillery, infantry, armour, logistics didn't exercise together, didn't get the opportunity to get that vital practice in. We'd begun to think that things had begun to change from the 1980s onwards, although perhaps there's a lesson here on how we think about the Russian army. The secret of success on the battlefield, ever since World War I, has been the use of combined arms: infantry, armour, artillery, engineers and logistics. In World War II, the Soviet army did this, but on a massive and often rigid and inflexible scale. This succeeded by sheer brute force, and it's been said that on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was better tactically, able to react to circumstances and change tactics accordingly, but the Soviet army was better operationally, the positioning and use of massive crushing force. What seems to have changed since the 1980s is increased flexibility and better combined arms training, and it's really about bringing mission command down to a lower level, down to the battalion tactical group. The BTG is a combined arms grouping, round about 800 strong. Now, composition does vary, but typically it is a motor rifle battalion, that is infantry mounted in IFVs, with a tank company, artillery and anti-aircraft units, combat engineers and logistic support. Now, these can operate either singly or in combination, so that should give you the opportunity to mount a good, cohesive all-arms operation. This is not happening. Why not? This has really got to do with the command structure, the training and the morale of the Russian army. Combined arms operations are complex and fast moving, and they require superb command and control and superb training amongst the individual units. And that applies to everybody, from the colonel commanding a battalion down to a corporal who is a squad leader. If you're not able to do this, if the soldier himself is not well trained, and if his officers and NCOs don't know what they're doing, then the whole thing falls apart. At the most basic level, every grunt debussing out of the back of this IFV has got to be superbly well trained, motivated, and he's got to have faith that his commanders actually know what they're doing. Training, motivation and leadership, good chain of command, are absolutely everything. Earlier in the war, we get quite a few Russian 1- and 2-star generals being killed in combat. Now, there can only really be one reason for that. The chain of command is broken down and senior officers are having to go forward to get things moving again. Even the basics seem to have been forgotten. Infantry-tank cooperation. Marshal Churkov, who was the defender of Stalingrad in World War II, said that whenever we could separate, German infantry and tanks both suffered. This lesson, first learnt on the Eastern Front in World War II and reinforced in places like Grozny and in Afghanistan, seems to have gone by the board. If somebody is out there stalking your armoured column with a javelin or NLAW, get your infantry out on the ground to sort them out. Of course, if your BTG is under strength and you're perhaps short of dismounts, as quite a few seem to be, that's going to be easier said than done. But there's no doubt about the fact that tanks are vulnerable without infantry, and vice versa. The other vital ingredient for battlefield success is, of course, ISTAR: intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance. Now, there seems to be a major failure in the Russian High Command to realise that the battlefield is a very different place these days. In the first few months of the war, there was a lot of coverage of Ukrainian forces achieving considerable success with new generation anti-tank weapons like NLAW and Javelin. And there's no doubt about the fact that they were practicing a very effective form of small unit asymmetrical warfare. But as the war has gone on, the major successes against Russian armour have been from artillery. And the reason for this is ISTAR. The battlefield these days, there's no way you can screen an armoured column from drone and satellite intelligence gathering, and tanks are taken out by artillery. Tanks and other AFVs have always been difficult to hide. Noise, bulk, massive exhaust plumes and infrared signatures make them pretty obvious. Now, with drone reconnaissance all pervasive, the first two skins of the survivability onion, don't be seen and don't be targeted, are startlingly difficult to achieve. Ukrainian artillery has achieved massive success in terms of knocking out Russian assets and breaking up attacking forces. So, where do we go now? Down in the Donbass, the spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, is well underway, and mud will be clogging up the works. But as the new campaigning season opens, I think we have to assume the Russian High Command will be reflecting on performance so far, and they will be looking at their strategy, their tactics, and also their shambolic logistics. Conscription or recruiting will presumably make up most of the losses so far, and of course there's one asset that hasn't really come into play much, and that is the Russian Air Force. On the Ukrainian side, things are going to depend on increasing supplies of lethal aid, and obviously the debate about tanks and fighter aircraft continues. If they do go onto the offensive, they're going to find that is considerably more difficult than their current defensive posture. When this all began, somebody with considerably more authority than me said there are two reasons for going to war. One, he's right on my side. Two, can I win? Now, from the Ukrainian perspective, I think we know the answer to the first. The second is still far too hard to call. Do hope you've enjoyed this, and if you did, please subscribe, and if you can, please support us on Patreon.